Today's scripture passage is 2 Samuel 12, 1 through 14. You're invited to turn there or follow along on the screen. The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, "There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb that he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for one who had come to him. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, 'As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity.' Then Nathan said to David, 'You are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you over king of Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah, and if all this has been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and you took his wife to be your own. You killed him in the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel.' Then David said to Nathan, 'I have sinned against the Lord.' Nathan replied, 'The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die, but because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die.'" This is God's word.
Now, I would imagine that this passage of Scripture might create some questions for you, questions that we may not deal with at all, or at least may not deal with them satisfactorily or fully enough for you this morning. So make note of the things that this passage stimulates in your mind, and afterwards, after our discussion this morning, if you have a question, express it, and we'll do our best to give a response to the question that this passage has generated for you. Now, 2 weeks ago, we were discussing David, and by the way, we're nearing the end of our series on the life of David. We have one more message planned in this series after today, and we will have given a pretty full account of this man's life. But 2 weeks ago, we dropped in on this man as he was making some really terrible choices. You read 2 Samuel chapter 11 and then chapter 12, the portion that we read today, and you think to yourself, is it really possible that a person who loves God can make the kind of choices that this man is making? And I would say to you, absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. As Tim Keller says, and we have referred to this quote of Tim Keller's several times over the last couple of years because I think it does a good job of summarizing the gospel. Here's the first part of the statement. Keller says, "You are far more sinful and wicked than you ever dared believe." Now let me say it again. You are far more sinful and wicked than you ever dared believe. You don't even know the half of it. That's the problem. That's the big Didn't we, Jason? Okay, so I'll just stay in front of this one, okay? Okay, so the second part of the gospel, and by the way, if you don't understand that first statement here, if you don't buy it, then you really cannot grasp the goodness of the second part of this definition. And here's the second part. This is the good news. And I'm going to read the first part and then add the second part. You are far more sinful and wicked than you ever dared believe, but you are far more loved and accepted in Christ than you ever dared hope. So in other words, you're a mess. But when you are in Christ, all of that mess, all of that rebellion, all that wickedness is forgiven by God. Now think about this. A Christian, guys, is not somebody who is without sin. And I hope you recognize that by now. A Christian is not a person who is without sin. So strike that notion. Rather, a Christian is somebody who knows that he or she is a mess and is trusting Jesus for forgiveness on the basis of what Jesus has done to pay for that mess. That's what a Christian is. And the result of this, then, the result is for a person who has grasped deeply and fully embraced what Jesus has done for them, the result is that begins to make a change in that person then begins to want to do what delights God. And this is Christian growth. This is what it means to be a Christ follower. Now, I want you to remember this, though. Think back to David and where we're at in his life now. That person, though, still must struggle with sinful passions, sinful desires, sinful lusts, and so on. In fact, the struggle really begins, the struggle really heightens when you have come to an acceptance of the gospel of God in your life. Because now there are two things at work in you. And this is what Paul refers to when he was writing to a group of Christians in the first century who lived in Galatia. Listen to what Paul said about this struggle that had begun in their lives now. He says, "But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desire of the flesh." Now stop. Spirit is capitalized, so what does that tell you? Referring to the Holy Spirit of God, who has now taken up a residence in your life. Walk by the Spirit, and you will not fulfill the desires of the flesh, which is the old you. All of these things which are part of you because you were born into a sinful race. Those don't go away, but now you've got a new voice and a new power. Now listen to what Paul continues to say. For the flesh, that's that natural part of you, sets its desire against the Spirit. And the Spirit against the flesh. You sense the struggle? For these are in opposition to one another, so that you may not do the things that you please. So Paul recognizes the struggle. Now let's go back to David here. David, in a time of leisure, found himself at a weak and vulnerable point. And he let his sexual appetites gain control of him. He fed them and he listened to them. Now 2 Samuel chapter 11, which was our last study in the life of David, told us that David saw a beautiful woman whose name was Bathsheba. This was a woman to whom David was not married, who in fact was married to somebody else. And David went and took her and used her like an entitled consumer would. Now, we talked 2 weeks ago about David's misuse here of God's very good gift of sex in this incident. Instead of confining his sexuality within the confines of committed marital intimacy, he illicitly took and consumed that to which he had no right. And furthermore, he violated and disrespected the marital rights of this woman and her husband. Now, the passage, though, says that he did more than sin sexually. The passage indicates that, and we also talked about this, that David misused the position and the power that God had given him when he did this. Remember, David was a very powerful man. He was king over a nation that was growing in power and influence. And rather than caring for and protecting and serving the people over which he ruled, he used his position and his power to order people around to get her for him. And I often have wondered, what power did Bathsheba have to say no to the king? And what power did Uriah, if he had known, have to forbid the king from taking his wife? Of course, Uriah wasn't available to say that to the king. But they had no power, is my point. And David had all the power, and he misused it. And we tend to do this at times. He victimized people using the power that God had given him. And that is a heinous crime. So David had misused a couple of things that God had given him: his sexuality and his position and power. And we learned that the end of all of this is that Bathsheba became pregnant. Now, finally, as we wound up our discussion, which was through the second half of 2 Samuel chapter 11, we saw David, after having messed up so badly, keep compounding his sin by doing things to try to bury it, by trying to cover it, by trying to conceal it. And after several attempts to make the pregnancy look like it was a legitimate pregnancy, that this child who was growing in Bathsheba's womb was actually the child of her husband, after all this failed, David reaches this conclusion to say, well, I'm going to have the man killed then. And so he very surreptitiously tries to carry this out and make it look as though it was just a casualty of war, just collateral damage. Or Uriah is a soldier, yeah, people in war get killed. Okay? And so he sets it up that Uriah will be killed and tries to make it look coincidental when it was not. It was murderous on David's part. And I thought, David is so busy trying to make this pregnancy appear to be legitimate when it isn't. And I was asking myself, why? Because David doesn't want to be known as an adulterer, even though he is an adulterer. And I thought, isn't that the way with us? We have hearts and private lives that are filled with foulness, but we don't want other people to know it. We want to be perceived to be something that we are not. We want to carefully manage that image. And this is what David is doing. And we do the same thing. However, and this is the very last verse of 2 Samuel chapter 11. It says, the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Now, is that not an understatement? The thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Nobody else knew, except for the accomplices in the deed. But God knew what David had done. And David was living out this charade in front of people, and he had been for a period of several months now. And one wonders how long David would have continued to live out this charade if God had not intervened. Maybe he would have taken those secrets to the grave. I don't know. But God was not about to allow this to be swept under the rug. Now, I'm going to make a statement here that might surprise you. God was merciful. Maybe you're thinking, what? God, in not allowing this to be swept under the rug, was merciful? I would say, yes. God was merciful to David. Yes. God knew that sweeping all of this under the rug would not be good for David. It wouldn't be good for anybody. And it wouldn't be good for you. Guys, hidden sin, as I've told you before, festers and it spreads. It destroys the soul. It decays and rots your relationship with God. I was picturing a big old tree in the backyard. Maybe you've got one of these or you've had one of these. A big old tree in the backyard, looks sound, looks good. First wind comes along, though, knocks that sucker down. And once it's knocked down, you realize that it's basically all eaten away inside. There's nothing inside. It's basically hollow. It was rotten all along, but you could not discern it by a mere external examination. Hidden sin. Got the picture? This is what it does. This is what it does to you. And it also affects your relationship not only with God, it affects your relationships with people. Because you wind up becoming a big phony, and the person that people think the people that are interacting with you, they think you're one thing and you're really not. So they're interacting with a falsehood. And it's kind of a weird thing. Now, God in his mercy spared David this type of progressive internal decay. Even though let me start this again. God in his mercy spared David this type of progressive internal decay, even though what follows does not look or feel to us much like mercy. God is actually sparing David. And this is what really struck me as I was thinking this over this week. Now, I want you to watch how God deals with David. Here's how it goes down. The Lord Yahweh sent Nathan to David. Who's Nathan? Nathan is David's spiritual advisor. He's a prophet of God that God uses to communicate things to David. And boy, what a job a prophet had, you know. These poor guys, half the time I think they didn't want to have to carry this message. Do I really have to go say this? I don't want to go. God uses Nathan to deliver. You realize that this is how John the Baptist wound up being beheaded, because he was a prophet and he spoke against the king's actions, specifically his sexual actions. He gets thrown in prison and he loses his head. Anyway, that was later, but this is what happens with these guys like Nathan, okay? So anyway, Nathan says yes to God. God sends him with a message to David. And the Lord sent Nathan to David, and when he came to him, he said, "There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing, except one little ewe lamb he'd bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food. It drank from his cup and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him." What was like a daughter to him? This little lamb. Now, a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare as a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. Now, guys, hoping you realize that this was a parable. God gave Nathan this parable to tell to the king as a way of enabling David to vividly see what he was doing. The foulness of it, the foulness of the course that he'd chosen. And he was even in the midst of still pursuing. Now, you guys, before we examine this parable, you guys remember that I've told you several times that our lusts, when we allow them to become inflamed, make us what I call sin stupid, sin blind, and we make stupid choices that we would never make if we were in our right minds. So much of our problem, guys, comes from the fact that we can't think straight when our lusts and our desires become inflamed. Now, this incident with David and Nathan's parable point this out to me vividly. God has to use a parable to get David to see what he's been doing, because he's been blind to it. He hasn't been able to see it. Look on the screen. Oh, and this is a prayer. Oh, that God would enable us to see things accurately on the front end before we act on our lusts. This is our problem. We get sin blinded, sin stupid. But all we tend to do is be able to see on the back end when the damage is done. Oh, that God would give us the wisdom to see beforehand. And this is something I would really encourage you to pray. I thought about this with relation to what Jesus did when he was being nailed to a cross. What did he say? "Father, forgive them, for they" what? Sin stupid. Sin stupid. Jesus acknowledged it. God, they don't even know what they're doing. God, open our eyes. So Nathan's parable then to David is meant to open his eyes. And what is the parable? It's an extraordinary parable. Think about this, okay? It's about a very rich man who has enormous privilege. He lives in abundance. He has far more than anybody could ever need in a lifetime. Not only that, but because he is so wealthy, he's also got all the power and influence. He can bark an order, and he's got people who will hop to do it. They'll jump at his word because he is so wealthy. Now, the problem is he's begun to believe that he is better than everybody else. All of his success has created a monster. He really thinks that he is all that. And he loves his abundance so much, it's got a hold of him. Now, meanwhile, there's a very poor man who lives just across the field, maybe one of the workers on this guy's estate. I don't know, I'm filling in blanks there. And this man has nothing. But the one modest joy in this man's life and the life of his family is this scrawny little sheep that has become like a pet to him and to his family. And I thought, frankly, if they were wise, they probably would have slaughtered it and had it for dinner because they were probably very malnourished. I've seen people like this in Africa. But they'd gotten emotionally attached to this little sheep. So little sheep is the one thing in life that brings joy to the man and to his kids. It's one of the few things that brings them joy in their meager, poverty-stricken little lives. And then an occasion arises which brings these two different parties together on a collision course. The rich man is called upon to receive some unexpected out-of-town guests. And according to the rules of Near Eastern culture, what is he bound to do? He's bound to extend hospitality, a certain level of hospitality to his guests, something which apparently he doesn't really relish. He doesn't want to do it. In fact, he seems to begrudge the expense that providing hospitality for these guests is going to bring upon him. So, what does he do? He is so selfish and loath to part with any of his precious wealth that he will not even take one of the sheep from his enormous flocks and have it prepared as a meal for his guests. Get this. Instead, believe it or not, this guy sends his servants across the field to the hovel of this poor, destitute neighbor of his, and he callously takes from that poverty-stricken family that one scrawny little sheep, the beloved family pet, and he has it butchered and served as a meal for his guests. All right, is your blood beginning to boil because of this parable at the injustice of it all? The selfishness of it all? It's supposed to. That's what the parable was designed to do. And of course, David, upon hearing this, is furious. He doesn't know it's a parable. He thinks this is really happening in his kingdom. He's like, not on my watch. No way. This man will be dealt with. He's going to make more than restitution, and he's going to pay with his life for the way he treated this poor man and his family. And David doesn't even realize his own duplicity. Sin, stupid. He doesn't realize that he has done this very thing, but it wasn't about an animal. It was about a woman and her husband and their family. And he doesn't even see it. So he thinks it really has happened. Then reacting this way, David has in essence condemned himself without even knowing it. And then Nathan delivers the hammer blow. And this has got to be one of the most disturbing sentences in the Bible. This is verse 7a. Then Nathan said to David, "You are the man." And David's stunned. It's like a dagger in the heart. It's like the scales fall from the eyes and he can see what he had not been able to see previously. His guilt flashed before him and he saw accurately the evil of what he had done. Guys, so often, and my wife and I were talking about this week, so often we think that our sin, even if it's private, has nothing to do with other people. We think it's just about us and God, and are not paying any attention to how it might affect other people, and we think it has no effect on anyone else. And oddly enough, David seems not to have noticed the damage that his choices were causing in other people's lives. At least, I think he maybe had shut down this part of his mind. Now, I wanted to use this occasion just to warn you. Guys, your sin is not just between you and God alone. Now, some of you, your minds might be going to David's penitential psalm, Psalm 51, where he says, "Against you and you only have I sinned." Well, yes, ultimately, it's God's law that has been broken. But clearly, David's sin affected other people.
This is what we're talking about here. Sin always affects other people, even if you can't see it, even if nobody else knows about it. Why would I say that? Because at the very least, it affects you, and then people's interactions with you are changed because your sin has affected you, even if they don't know what's going on. David had victimized other people very seriously, and God called him out on it through this parable. This was the thrust of it. Now, God's message to David through Nathan continues. This is verse 7b through verse 9a. This is what the Lord Yahweh, the God of Israel, says, David, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of Yahweh by doing what is evil in his eyes? I want you to notice here how David's sin feels to God. God uses the word despise. David, why have you despised me this way? This is the way it feels to God. Now, it's interesting. The ancient Hebrew idiom despise here in this context means to think less of God's desires than we do of our own desires. It means to think less of his demands than we do of the dictates of our own hearts. It's preferring the one over the other. And in so doing, we despise God's viewpoint. We make ourselves out to be our own gods, as though we are the ones who should be making the rules by which our lives will be ordered. And the message that we send to God when we do this is simply this: you, God, and your desires are not important to me. When we do not take the commands of God seriously, we, in essence, despise him. Now, I thought it was interesting, too, that the backdrop for all of this is God's kindness to David. Did you notice this? God first shows David all of the grace that he has shown David throughout the years. He says, I anointed you king. I gave you the kingship. I gave you the kingdom. I gave you the house of Saul. I gave you, and I gave you, and I gave you, and I gave you, and I gave you. And if that were too little, I would have given you even more. And then he says, why, against that backdrop, have you despised me this way? Guys, it is against this backdrop of God's kindness that David has despised God, and our sin is no different. Every moment that you and I live is a gift of God's grace. Every breath you draw is his gracious gift to you. God is the giver of every good thing you have ever experienced in life, and yet we still decide we want to do things our own way. There was a phrase that came to my mind this week that I have heard used a lot over the years. Here's the phrase: all sin is a sin against love. And you see that in the way God responds here. I have done all this for you. Why would you despise me in this way? And I want to take a bit of a rabbit trail here and talk about this. Why is it true that all sin is a sin against love? I'm going to try to get myself away from the notes here and just relate to you this idea personally. Sometimes we have in our minds that God sometime arbitrarily, through the eons of time, made a couple of different lists, or a list that has two different columns to it, okay? And in the one column, God says, I'm going to put this. This will be acceptable to me. I'll put it in the acceptable column. Now, this one over here, let's say sexuality practiced outside of the bonds of marital intimacy. We're going to put that one in the no-no category. Yeah, we'll put that one over there. And this one over here, we'll put this one over here in that list too. And this one we'll put in the good list. This side, we'll put this one over here in the bad. As though it were arbitrarily chosen. And what we don't realize is that God has a certain character and nature that is solid, that is fixed, that is unchangeable. And everything in creation has that character of God woven into it. And anything that is in line with God's character, as expressed in his laws, as expressed in the order of creation, everything that is in line with it is right. But everything that distorts or twists even slightly or rebels against God's character is by definition sin. There wasn't an arbitrary choosing. It's not as if God decided he wanted to deny you pleasures that he just was cranky about and didn't want you having fun. That is not the way it works. Whatever does not fit in accordance with God's character is by default in this category. It's sin. And it causes disruption and decay in his very good order. And it is insulting and offensive to him just by his nature and its nature. And it brings with it damage. And God despises the damage that sin brings into your life and to his perfect order. He despises it. He hates the damage. He doesn't want you damaged because you're part of that very good creation. So look on the screen. God despises sin because it assaults the good of all that he intended and created, including you. He hates sin because it destroys. All sin is against this. All sin is against this love of his. Now, the second half of verse 9, going on to verse 12, continues what God has to say to David. You, David, struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, David, the sword will never depart from your house because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord Yahweh says. Out of your own household, David, I'm going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes, I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. By the way, if you've never read the story of King David in the Bible, you realize this happened. Literally, it happened. His own son, Absalom, later leads a rebellion against his father, the king. And one of the signs of his disrespect for his father and that he is taken over is he sleeps with all the king's concubines on a housetop. It literally happened. And the passage continues. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel. Now, does God seem a little cranky, a little mad about this? And I struggled with this week. Before I address that, let's read the next two verses. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against Yahweh. Nathan replied, Yahweh's taken away your sin. You're not going to die. But because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord Yahweh, the son born to you will die. Now, I want to make three summary statements about what we just saw transpiring here, okay? And then we're going to deal with that thorny question of God seeming really vindictive and smacking him down. First of all, what has happened here, David has recognized and owned and turned from his sin. He's recognized it, he's owned it, and he's turned from it now, finally. You see that in verse 13. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against Yahweh. And I would recommend that you go home this afternoon and read the diary entry of King David of Israel that he composed upon the receipt of Nathan's parable. Psalm 51 is it. It's David's penitential prayer when he heard from God. It's amazing, amazing. Now, the second thing that I don't want you to miss here is that God forgave David his sins. You see that in the second half of verse 13. Nathan replied, "The Lord Yahweh has taken away your sin." But the third thing you need to see, and this is one of the main points I would like you to take away this morning, is that God's forgiveness did not preempt the inevitable and enormous consequences of David's sin. My wife's pastor, as she was growing up, had a saying that he would reiterate quite frequently, and this is it. Sin has its own built-in destructive factors. Write it down. I should have put it on a slide for you. Sin has its own built-in destructive factors. I believe that he was right. Guys, when you violate God's perfect order of things, it introduces or injects an ill health of sorts. There are inevitable consequences to you and to other people. But this section of verses seems to indicate that God took a direct role in inflicting what I will call discipline upon David following his sin. And it might give the impression that God is vindictive, sort of tit for tat, wanting to smack David around for stepping out of line. But I want you to think deeper here. Okay? And in order to help you think more deeply, I'm going to direct your thoughts to Hebrews chapter 12. And this is a couple of excerpts. Actually, it's verses 5 and 6, and then verses 8 through 12 of Hebrews chapter 12. Now listen and keep in mind the incident with David. The writer to the Hebrews says this, "And have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son?" It says, "My son, don't make light of the Lord's discipline, and don't lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as a son. If you're not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness." Why did God do this for David? It was a gift of mercy. It was an act of love that David would be made holier. Verse 11, "No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it." Not for those who rebel against it, but for those who allow themselves to be shaped and molded and trained in holiness by it. So guys, sometimes God brings strong discipline upon his children because of sin, and I used to see it as retributive. God getting retribution. Now I don't. Now I see it as an act of God's grace. Guys, think, for sin to have no consequences at all to us would be like letting your children eat bag after bag after bag of Halloween candy every day for 18 years as they grew up. Never fencing them, never policing them, never stopping them, never warning them, never depriving them of anything, never letting them suffer the consequences of their choices, shielding them from it. Would that be good for them? No. Because you love as a parent, you let the kid feel the burden of the choices that he or she has made. And you inflict discipline because you love the child. And it occurred to me, guys, boundaries and consequences from God are an act of his love for people. Consider, for example, the gift of pain. Pain warns you that something is wrong. Nobody likes it, but you better be glad for it. It warns you that something is wrong. And it says this course of action is not right. It's twisted and it will bring destruction. It would actually be unloving of God not to teach us that sin is poison. How is it poison? In that it separates us from him and destroys our souls like that rotted out tree. You think God would be better if he just let us go? David and Bathsheba, guys, in 4 simple sentences. And here's how we wrap it up. 1, David sinned badly. Yes, the man after God's own heart sinned badly. 2, he eventually owned it, turned from it, and dealt with it. Eventually. 3, God let David feel the damage that his sin had caused. And that was a good thing. And 4th, this does not mean that God does not love or forgive. It should actually help us value God's grace all the more.